Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace, love, and blessings of Allah be with you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We begin in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Today we're talking about spiritual activism. Spiritual activism. Now, the reason I'm going to talk about this is the last few sessions I've talked about a lot of different feelings and a lot of different contexts that are really to do with work. So we looked at how injustice doesn't cause anger. And even though injustice doesn't cause anger, that doesn't mean, to stop campaigning against injustice. I say campaign against injustice, but don't act from your feelings, right? So you can be seeing injustice, be peaceful, and then campaign against the injustice, which is different from seeing injustice, being really angry and in a state of anger trying to campaign. That anger is going to burn out very quickly, and it's going to make you do foolish and unjust things, even as you're trying to stop injustice. So we talked about anger. Then we talked about, I told you the story about my friend, the end of worry, right? I told you the story about my friend who was really worried. She's a human rights lawyer, and she was really worried about her client. And I told you some other stories too, right? So we had a few. Just now, I told you the story about when I was really stressed about my exams. And again, the solution to stress is to see the inside out paradigm and to realize that your feeling of stress isn't telling you about what's going on. Your feeling of stress is telling you about your state of mind. So with all that being said, it raises a question of people talk about how spirituality and activism are two separate things. Like peace and love and forgiveness, that's all one thing. And then the real world of acting and changing the world, that's another thing. Almost as though acting from peace and love isn't going to change the world. So I want to talk about this concept of spiritual activism, and I want to talk about a couple of myths. But first, I'll tell you a story about where I felt burnt out. So when I was at university, I told you before that I had exams. Well, after my exams, I was a student activist at university, and I actually became the communications officer of the Students' Union. And when I was the communications officer of the Students' Union, that is a proper political activism role. You have a high status in the NUS. You run in the you have an you run in the National Union of Students. You're responsible for basically you're the main political figurehead of the union. And when I was in that position, it was really hard and it was really draining. And I was always trying to find a balance between being connected with Allah and political activism, because it felt like being involved in politics and being involved in campaigning and that kind of thing, it felt really draining. And I got burnt out. I did. I remember one particular day when I remember a couple of occasions. On one particular occasion, I went into a meeting with other political activists, one of whom in particular really hated my guts because she was a little bit Islamophobic. She didn't like the fact that I was a Muslim, and she didn't like the fact that she assumed that I was homophobic, right? So she had all these negative things about me, which I wasn't, at all. She didn't know me personally at all, but she had all these prejudices against me. And one day we sat in a meeting and she just goes, "Mamoon, you are and she swore, I'm not going to, but basically she swore in a way to say, "You're a terrible communications officer." And it really hurt my feelings. Really hurt my feelings. And I left the meeting and I just felt really down, and I just felt so burnt out and so sad and and I never confronted her about it because I didn't want to argue with her, and I was just too drained and burnt out. And recently, actually a couple of weeks ago during this Ramadan, I was talking with a friend of mine from university who was a fellow student activist with me. Right, so she's an activist as well, and she's still a political activist. And I said, and we just got, we were catching up. And she said, actually, you know what? The number one challenge with being a political activist is that it's just, it can be so draining, and it can really take its toll on you psychologically. And when she said take its toll on you psychologically, I realized psychology is spirituality. That means it takes its toll on you spiritually. So what's the solution? Well, I want to bust through a couple of myths. Before my whole life, I'd been approaching activism from an outside-in perspective, of I need to change the world in order to change my feelings. Like back when I was a student, I was like, when we're doing this big campaign to ensure that we always have a prayer room for Manchester University. Alhamdulillah, now they do. Part of which was due to the work that we did back in our day. So they have a prayer room now. But we were like, I was campaigning because they were going to knock down the prayer room and they weren't going to replace it. And I was saying to myself, when our prayer room is secure, then I'll feel okay. Outside in. That's saying my feeling of feeling okay comes from there being a prayer room, right? Now, that's false. That's not true. Whether or not we had a prayer room, that doesn't affect our feelings. Is it better to have a prayer room? Yeah. Am I going to campaign to have a prayer room? Yeah. But back then, I had bought into the outside in. Remember, so I'm just saying this to remind you, the outside in is believing that doing things in the world will cause your feelings. That's outside in. It doesn't work that way. The truth is your feelings come from inside of you. Now, when you see, this causes a huge change when you're an activist, because from the outside in, there's a big myth that happens. And the myth is taking action is draining. When you believe your feelings come from something other than thought, then what happens is you take a lot of action as an activist, as a peace activist. You might take a lot of action and then you might feel drained. And then you fall into the myth that taking action itself is draining. Well, that's not true. When we look at it from an inside-out perspective, realizing that feeling just comes from thought, we realize that your state changes at the speed of thought. Your state changes from moment to moment, which means you could be taking action and have a really inspired thought, and you're not drained at all. You feel totally energetic and you want to take even more action. Or you could be taking action and have an uninspired thought and feel drained, right? Taking action, but one moment you're inspired, the next moment you're drained, and it's got nothing to do with whether you take action or not. Similarly, you could be doing nothing all day and then feel really drained at the end of the day. Like you didn't do anything. You just sat around watching TV, and then at the end of the day, you feel all drained. How did that happen? It's because whether or not you're drained, whether or not you have energy, has nothing to do with what you're doing. It's to do with your state of mind. All right? So the first big myth I want you to see through is that taking action is draining. Taking action isn't draining. Your state of mind determines whether taking action determines whether you're drained or not. And your state of mind changes at the speed of thought. Okay. Second myth. I'm going to write myth number 2. Spirituality is passive. Spirituality is passive. This is a myth. And it comes from this idea that spirituality is passive. It comes from the idea that when we do our acts of worship, you go and sit in a mosque and you read the Quran and you pray and you sit down and you meditate and you do dhikr. And they all seem like very passive things, but they're not. That's not spirituality. Spirituality is Spirituality doesn't just happen when you're sitting in a mosque, and it doesn't just happen when you're reading the Quran, and it doesn't just happen when you're praying. In fact, sometimes it doesn't happen when you're doing those things because your mind isn't in the right place, right? Spirituality isn't just doing those things. Spirituality is 24/7. It's all day, every day. The work you do to make a living is spiritual when you're coming from the right place. Your work is worship. Your work is spiritual. Your actions are spiritual when you're doing them from the right place. And what do I mean when I say when you're doing them from the right place? I mean when you're doing them in full awareness that Allah is there with you and that the actions you do don't determine your feelings. When you're looking in the right direction, as I've said before, it means when you're looking at life from an inside-out perspective. When you do that, all of spirituality becomes very active. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. This is أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. May the peace, love, and blessings of Allah be with you always.